Now it's time to talk about the malt that we use to make the beer at Rock Bottom. Actually, all brewers use malt to make beer, so we're not all that exclusive in that fashion. Many of you noticed that outside your restaurant there's a big silo that we keep the base malt in. Some of you don't have that silo, and that malt is brought into the brewery in bags, right? Well, that base malt makes up a large portion of the beer that we make. I call the palest malt, the base malt, the white flour of beer. Just like in a cake, it's mostly white flour than a lot of other things that augment it. We'll talk a little bit about how the barley is processed so you have an understanding of that, because I think it's really important. Essentially, barley comes in from the fields to the malt houses, and what malting process is essentially is it modifies the grain to a point where we can make beer with it. So the initial step is to bring the barley in and wet it down, steep it in a big steeping tank at the malt house. Essentially what it's doing, it's getting ready to germinate the grain. If you remember, when you were a kid, you may have done an experiment in science class where you took some seeds and put it inside a wet paper towel, kept it warm, and a couple days later, you came back and there was a little sproutlet that came out the end of the seed, and that was the germination of the seed. Well, the same thing happens in the malting process. Once the germination occurs, the maltsters knock off that sproutlet and send it on the next step of the process. And here it's important to note that the reason we germinate the grain is to activate the enzymes inside that grain. Those enzymes will go on to convert the starches in the grain into sugars that the yeast will be able to ferment. So that's really important to remember. The second step of the malting process is to begin kilning, which is a big oven at different temperatures, roasting or kilning, essentially cooking the grains at different temperatures for different lengths of time to create different colors, as you can see here. Also activating different flavors in the malt. So as we talk about the different malts and their flavors, a lot of that comes down to this very simple process of malting. It's not a different base barley per se, but a different way of treating that barley to get these flavors out of it, which is really important to note. Once it's killed to the right color and specifications for the maltster, that malt is then bagged up or stored so it can be bagged later and sent out to breweries across the world to make beer with.